And we are back, everybody. As promised, we've got the legendary, the magnificent, the fantastic Leonard Ulrich joining us on the second part of this interview having to do with the New World Order. And we were just talking about a couple of things before we did this start of the interview. Mr. Ulrich, if I remember correctly from our last interview, you are a woodworker as well as a documentary filmmaker, having to do with subjects like the New World Order, doing a full history, comprehensive history of the New World Order. You got some. I was checking out your YouTube channel, as a matter of fact, and I found a fantastic, incredibly blunt video with George Soros on your YouTube channel, that befuddled me. And this is kind of sidetracking from our introduction, but in it, essentially, George Soros is like, "Hey, you know what? I was trying to live, so I went ahead and sold out my fellow Jews and took all their stuff. And, I was 14 years old and I posed as a Christian, even though I'm not a Christian. And I did it so I could survive. And I don't even feel a little bit bad about it, a little bit bad about it at all." Is that correct?
My understanding is that you went out with this protector of yours who swore that you were his adopted godson.
Yes, yes.
Went out, in fact, and helped in the confiscation of property from the Jews.
That's right. Yes.
I mean, that sounds like an experience that would send lots of people to the psychiatric couch for many, many years. Was it difficult?
Not at all.
That is absolutely correct. And if you look at the video notes below the YouTube video window, you will see that I love to cross-reference videos or pieces of media, quotations with other quotations and other pieces of media, and you will come across articles like the one in the Los Angeles Times, how George Soros admits he has a quote-unquote God complex. Now, see, you are starting, Joseph and Gwen, to really get into the nature of evil, where, the most accurate representation or description of the process of falling deeper and deeper into evil is found in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to the rest of the chapter. You essentially get your mind off God, and then you put your eye on nature. And because nature is impersonal, you start casting your eye onto your own actions. And then eventually you can justify anything because you think you're your own God. And that is exactly the camp that George Soros falls into. Now, there's a lot of people in the Christian community all around the world who think that people who call themselves Jews are immune from any kind of temptation or immune or exempt from involvement in any kind of evil. And I'm here to say that is patently false. As a matter of fact, certain quotations by French philosopher Voltaire come to mind. And one of them is that if you want to know who really holds power in a society, find out who you're not allowed to criticize.
Oh, wow. That's actually that's really good and really true. I hadn't heard that quote before. I know Voltaire was essentially he was a backslidden, like a Presbyterian or a Huguenot or something like that. By the end of his life, he was an atheist, I believe, at least a humanist at that. And his great opponent was Rousseau, I believe, who was born in the shadow of the church in Geneva, where John Calvin pastored years before that. But they both basically fought, I believe, they were philosophers that fought for a freedom of speech and stuff, basically human or American ideals before America turned into a giant hypocrite.
That is right. You can summarize all of that in the term of the Enlightenment. And yes. I put that term in quotation marks because it's really secular humanism, which goes back to Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to the rest of the chapter, which basically says, eventually you can justify anything. So you get your mind off God, put it on nature, put it on yourself, and then eventually you can do as you please, which is ironically the satanic maxim, which is do what thou wilt, which is in complete contradiction to what Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane.
So on this, and then we'll get to our questions because we didn't even finish. We didn't even get halfway through our questions last time we did this interview. But your video, it was a clip from 1998 with George Soros, and the only reason why I'm even bringing it up still is because I was so stunned by how forthright he was in answering the questions. And the guy even said, "Hey, so I'm a Jew, and what if I were in the same spot that these people that you sold out were in? Would you do the same thing to me?" And his justification was I was 14 years old. But you put on there George Soros and then Revelation 3:9. Could you explain that a little bit?
Absolutely. Last time we talked, we got into the foundation of the New World Order in terms of ancient history all the way up to the quote-unquote Enlightenment, with the creation of Freemasonry and the Illuminati, and we separated a lot, and I do mean a lot, of fiction from fact. And so basically, I would like to do a 20 times speed recap of our previous conversation, not only just to get everything fresh in our mind, but because, like we said in our pre-interview discussion, I'm recording all this now via video. And for the first time, I can allow my YouTube viewers in on our conversation, not only auditorially, but also visually. And it is far, far too painful for me to go back and do what I used to do, which is hand splice the audio to make it constantly synchronized with the video of my own microphone, and then go back to your audio source, Joseph, and then splice that in. And then splice in video clips on top of all that. So literally, thanks to technology, I'm now able to deliver these discussions at about 3 times the speed of what I normally did. So because I'm not going to upload the video of our last conversation, here we go. Here is what I would call a 5-minute turbocharged version of our previous discussion, and then we will get back into the precise question that you asked, which is about what's the deal with George Soros and Revelation 3:9. So I emailed you a copy of a chart, which is an upside-down pyramid. Did you manage to look at that in your email?
The email number 1 was a chart that you had emailed me, and then number 2, for some reason my email couldn't pull the second email up.
Oh, okay. All right. If you could try, you know what I'm going to do right now? I'm going to send that to you again. So here we go, because that is critical. Okay, it should come to your computer in about 2 seconds. And as you're digging through that, this chart, which I'm holding up here for my viewers, as well as your listeners and my listeners, comes from an awesome book called En Route to Global Occupation by Gary Cobb. And when I first see models of certain things, I go, well, that's just the author's opinion. What I need to do is independently verify this model. And after 10, 12 years of research, I can tell you that Gary Cobb's model of the New World Order is 100% correct. And this comes from a double major in history and former history teacher who really enjoys finding mistakes. And if I can find mistakes, it's good. So the New World Order is founded on ancient mystery religions, and then it merged into Kabbalism, which is quote-unquote Jewish mysticism. Remember, the Bible says that some of the Jews, quote, longed for the flesh pots of Egypt. And it is my contention, although this is a whole other discussion, that some earthly rulers, up to and including some of the Roman emperors weren't entirely human. And no, I'm not talking about space aliens. I'm talking about the Nephilim. And that is a whole other subject, which we will not get into tonight. So then you've got, from the Kabbalistic traditions, you've got Gnosticism. And then Gnosticism flowed into the Knights Templars, which were started out in sincerity, but eventually became totally satanic and became a protection racket for Christians on their way to the Holy Land to fight in the Crusades. Then the Knights Templars were more of a military slash financial racket, but you had a Gnostic core, and that Gnostic core eventually grew into the Rosicrucian movement, which is what I would call Christian heresy, just as I would call Kabbalism Jewish heresy. And by the way, you don't have to be Jewish, quote unquote, or Christian, quote unquote, to be totally involved in these ideologies. I mean, you can say whatever you want about Madonna. David Bowie was a practitioner of Kabbalistic traditions. So this, what I'm talking about, goes back all the way to the Sumerian times. Then, in 1717, you have the world's first Freemasonic lodge. And eventually, you had a secret society within a secret society called the Illuminati. And boy, oh boy, if you watch Dan Brown-based movies or read anything by Dan Brown, and you think that's history, you really need to keep your historical perceptions in check, because that's totally fictionalized. And so the Illuminati were headed up by a renegade Catholic named Adam Weishaupt. Adam Weishaupt was not a Jesuit, and he was not a Jew. How do we know that? Well, because his parents both were buried in Catholic cemeteries. And so at a young age, Adam Weishaupt was orphaned and was sent to live with his uncle, who happened to be the rector of Ingolstadt University. And just as Adam Weishaupt was transitioning from being a student to being a professor at the University of Ingolstadt, a Catholic university, the Pope at the time banned the Jesuits, which is a bit of a joke because the Jesuits keep coming back over and over and over again, and the current Pope is a Jesuit. So that lets you know a lot about the quote-unquote infallibility of the Pope and the quote-unquote authenticity or sincerity of the Jesuit order. And so the Illuminati lasted only about 8 years, and they were discovered by the Bavarian government, and they were, of course, a subversive group interested in overthrowing all authority, especially monarchical authority, then overthrowing all religion, and then overthrowing private property, etc., etc. Now, I get into these details because the goals of the Illuminati were carried forward into the goals of communism. The goals of communism and the goals of the Illuminati are identical. So please don't tell me that this is just a dry history lesson which never affected people, because about 100 million people were killed in the past 105 years by the glorious communist revolution from the Ukraine and Poland all the way to the easternmost parts of the Chinese Empire. So this really affects us today. A lot of people would be alive, and hundreds of millions of people would be alive if it weren't for the Communist Manifesto, which came out of the Illuminati. So time moved on, and the Illuminati went underground and popped up again in the Jacobin Club, which led to the French Revolution. Now, that's significant because the French Revolution was almost entirely a secular revolution. And the American Revolution had a strong, quote-unquote, religious component to it. Now, of course, that's a loaded term, but we'll just have to leave it dangling in the air for now. There were a lot of subversive / underground movements which penetrated America at the time. And honestly, it's only by God's grace that the American Revolution went as well as it did and did not secularize America like it secularized France through the French Revolution. So again, as an amateur trained historian, double major in history, 7 years experience as a history teacher, I can say categorically again and again and again that the Christian church should have been snuffed out, but only by God's grace does the church move on. And so we just basically went through a 5,000-year history of occult secret societies. We talked about how the communist movement was a byproduct of or an offshoot from Freemasonry / the Illuminati. And I'm here to tell you that a huge shift has taken place in who governs the world over the past 250 years. And this huge shift doesn't happen overnight. It's literally a 250-year process. And that process can be summed up in 3 bullet points. 250 years ago, most power in the world flowed through monarchical power. Then, thanks to the so-called Enlightenment and secularization and modernization through the Industrial Revolution, a new power emerged in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that was industrial / financial power. And now I'm seeing the third phase in a 3-phase change over the past 250 years, and that is a transfer from monarchical power to industrial financial power to technological power. It is now my contention that whoever is on top of the technological totem pole or technological pyramid, if you will become the quote-unquote new small g god, or part of the pantheon of small g gods of planet Earth, just as historian F. William Engdahl so brilliantly wrote Gods of Money. And this is one of my, I'd say, top 10 books here, holding up on the screen here, Gods of Money by F. William Engdahl. As a matter of fact, I endorse any book by F. William Engdahl. I've only read 3 of his books. I got to read another 2. It's on my list of about 500 books that I need to read. I just never stop reading, because if you only get your information from one source, besides the Bible, you're going to think, oh, I now have a complete model of history. That is not true. I can tell you that my paradigm, my way of looking at certain things has changed several times since I released my first film back in 2011, not because I wasn't sure of the authenticity or accuracy of my models, but because new information came up and new technologies have come up. And one of those technologies is the blockchain, and we will get into that. But for now, for your listeners and for my viewers, I can now sit here and say that over the past 3 weeks, my entire paradigm of the current power structure, financial structure has totally changed in response to blockchain technology and quantum computing and cryptocurrencies. And we will get into that tonight. So that was a 5 to 10 minute summarization of our previous discussion. And now to answer your question directly, what is the deal with George Soros and Revelation 3:9? Well, Revelation 3:9 is echoed in Revelation 2:9. And any student of Bible prophecy, any passionate reader of the Bible will tell you that chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation are not only John's literal letters to 7 literal churches, primarily in the Turkish area. We used to call it Asia Minor. We now call it Turkey, essentially. But they were a prophetic future description of the 7 phases of future church history. And we went through them last time, and I'll run through them again at about 5 times speed. So Ephesus, 33 to 170 AD, the loveless church. Smyrna, 200 to 300 AD, the persecuted church. Pergamos, 300 to 600 AD, the lenient church. Thyatira, depending on how you say tomato or tomato, 600 to 1517 AD, and that was called the compromising church, in my opinion. Sardis, 1517 to 1750, and why 1517? Because that is when Martin Luther arrived on the scene and said to the Catholic Church, I am sick and tired of you, and that literally split the church in two. And I call the church period of Sardis, 1517 to 1750, the lifeless church. Of course, it was being reformed. Philadelphia, 1750 to 1945 AD, the obedient church. And the Church of Laodicea, in my opinion, 1945 AD to present. Now, as a historian, I would love to debate the historiography of what I just said, which means historiography is the art of interpreting historical data. So the time ranges that I gave you are approximate. I mean, we can get into a whole discussion about this, kind of like we can get into a discussion about when did the Industrial Revolution begin. Well, you can have a master's level discussion about that. Did it start with the steam engine? Did it start with the cotton ginny? Or, in my opinion, did it start when 10% of the factories of America employed either the cotton ginny and or the steam engine? I prefer a more precise definition, which I just told you. So I just ran through those church ages because I wanted to highlight the second church age and the second last church age. The Church of Smyrna, 200 to 300 AD, and the Church of Philadelphia, 1750 to 1945 AD. Why? Because those were the 2 ages of church history which were most persecuted by those, as Revelation 2 verse 9 and Revelation 3 verse 9 say, by those who say they are Jews and are not, but do lie, and are a member of the Church of Satan, or satanic church, or synagogue of Satan. As a matter of fact, it doesn't say church, it says synagogue of Satan. So it literally qualifies the opposition to the church in those 2 ages 3 or 4 different ways. Those who say they are Jews and are not, but do lie, and are members of the synagogue of Satan. Those are the words of the Bible, and they're not my opinion. So back in Smyrna, 200 to 300 AD, you had the Jews once again appealing to the Roman government, just like they did during Jesus' day. And Emperor Diocletian came down hard on the church once again during that period because the Jews were saying, oh, this hypocritical religious order is disturbing the social fabric, etc., etc. Now, fast forward to 1750 to 1945 AD, the Church of Philadelphia. Why do I get into that? Well, that is because Revelation 3:9, in my opinion, centers on that church era. The era in which 100 million people were persecuted by the glorious, quote-unquote, communist revolution, which was headed up disproportionately by those who, in the Bible, say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. And as a matter of fact, I can qualify that, again, 6 ways till Sunday. All of my sources here are Jewish. Here we go. Here's an article from the Jerusalem Post. Lenin's Jewish roots put on display in Russian museum. Documents apparently confirming rumors that Vladimir Lenin had Jewish ancestors can now be seen at Russia's State History Museum, Associated Press reported on Monday. And this comes from September 10th. No, that is today, obviously. The date is unknown here, but you can go to the Jerusalem Post and type in the article title, Lenin's Jewish roots put on display in Russian Museum. And you can see that Lenin told his sister to keep his family's Jewish roots quiet. Then there's the good old master of Marxism himself, Moses Mordecai Levy, not Karl Marx, Moses Mordecai Levy. Karl Marx was his quote-unquote Christian name. Both Karl Marx's paternal and maternal grandparents, or grandfathers rather, were rabbis. Then there's good old Leon Trotsky, whose real name was Lev Davidovich Bronstein. And he came from New York, financed with several $100 million, a trainload of gold from New York, which found its way to Switzerland and then eventually to the Russian front to finance the Russian Revolution. And every time people ask, oh, you know, I don't understand how the Russian Revolution got started, I say, well, okay, can you explain how ISIS got started? And they look at me and they go, no, I can't. I say, okay, follow the money. Where did ISIS...
Right.
Yeah, where did ISIS get its money from? Where did the Russian communists get their money from? Where did Adolf Hitler get his money from? Answer, Wall Street, Wall Street, Wall Street. It's all
money,
the
money,
same.
money.
Absolutely. It doesn't change. And the only reason why, quote-unquote, ISIS, which is just really Al-Qaeda rebranded or repackaged, is so alive and well in Western Syria is because we're constantly, mistakenly, quote-unquote, dropping airlifts supplies to them.
A Bulgarian reporter has spoken to RT after she says she was fired and interrogated for exposing an Azerbaijani state-run airline's involvement with international weapons shipments. On August 24th, Dilyana Gaitensheva tweeted, quote, "I've just got fired for telling the truth about weapons supplies for terrorists in Syria on diplomatic fights." Her story was published in the largest Bulgarian daily newspaper in circulation back in July. Since then, Bulgarian authorities have interrogated her, demanding she reveal her sources, and she was eventually fired.
And they just, you know, parade around in Toyota Tundra trucks and American Humvees, up-armored. And they managed to get their hands on helicopters and tanks and everything else. And, you know, it's like, this is a big mystery. Where did ISIS come from? Where did they get all this hardware from?
Look at these images. ISIS fighters riding in Toyota pickups and Toyota Land Cruisers. Authorities now asking the automaker, can they help officials figure out why ISIS has so many Toyotas?
The answer is, we gave it to them. Why? Because we always need a boogeyman to fight.
Well, now we have a colonel from the IDF being arrested in Iraq, and he was leading ISIS militants. Funny how it all comes full circle, and you can see how this man, and would you believe it, this man has been working within our government here in the United States. The same man right here, as you can see in the picture with McCain, and guess who's in the background? Their fake caliph. That's right, Simon Elliott. Now dressed as the ISIS leader. You guys remember me showing his big old watch he had on and all this other stuff? He is a Zionist Mossad agent running this whole thing. We'll talk about boogeymen like bin Laden. And you can see who's behind this whole scheme. So, this arrest proves Mossad involvement directly with ISIS. Look no further. What was he doing there? If it was truly the enemy, they'd have his head cut off. He was giving the orders. For those paying attention, this says it all on who's behind this and who's involved in this. A lot of players, a lot of countries, but this nail in the coffin proves Israel, the United States, hand in hand behind this whole ISIS operation.
Well, that and war notoriously makes all sorts of money once you have it. Just backtracking real quick because I want to be able to put this on our podcast for the show notes. Who was Moses?
Sorry, you dropped out there?
I'm sorry. Who was Moses Mordecai again?
Moses Mordecai Levy was Karl Marx's real name. And then Lev Davidovich Bronstein became known as Leon Trotsky. And then Stalin's real last name was Ulyanov, which is of Jewish ancestry. And the grand killer within the Stalinist Gulag system is a name that I only became aware of about 2-3 years ago, which is kind of ironic because as a double major in history and former history teacher, you think, well, okay, what else am I going to learn, right? Well, we learn of what I call the Jewish Hitler of the Russian Gulag system, and his name was Genrikh Yagoda. Now I'm going to spell that. Genrkhoda. Genrikh Yagoda. And this is in an article which I totally applaud. It's from Ynet, which is a Jewish source. It's from Sever Plocker, and the article is entitled Stalin's Jews. The subtitle is, "We mustn't forget that some of the greatest murderers of modern times were Jewish." And I'm just going to read about 4 sentences here. "And us, the Jews, an Israeli student finishes high school without ever hearing the name Genrikh Yagoda, the greatest Jewish murderer of the 20th century, the GPU's deputy commander and the founder and commander of the NKVD. The NKVD, by the way, was the forerunner to the KGB. Yagoda diligently implemented Stalin's collectivization orders and is responsible for the deaths of at least 10 million people. His Jewish deputies established and managed the Gulag system. After Stalin no longer viewed him favorably, Yagoda was demoted and executed and replaced as chief hangman in 1936 by Yezhov, the bloodthirsty dwarf." So it's not surprising why here in the West we don't hear the name Genrikh Yagoda, because he's a suppressed name within the suppressive former communist system. So it's kind of hard to crack that double nut, kind of like it's hard to crack a double nut of the Illuminati. And if you look at pictures of Genrikh Yagoda, he's got the Adolf Hitler mustache. I mean, literally. But he's Jewish, and he's killing Christians primarily. And you'll never, ever, ever hear that name. So Genrikh Yagoda killed about 10 million, mostly Christians, and as near as I can tell, only about 1.5 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. And of course, the number of 6 million, it's constantly rammed down our throat. And I say, okay, multiply that by 10. And now you know how many people died under the glorious communist revolution of General Mao. So I ask people, all you hear is the assassination of the Jews. I mean, that's been rammed down our throats for decades. What have you heard about the assassination of the Chinese under Chairman Mao, which was 10 times worse? And all I hear is crickets. So just like Voltaire said...
It seems like...
So just like Voltaire said, if you want to know who has power in this society, find out who you're not allowed to criticize.
I need to write that quote down. But it seems like, and I'm not anti-Jewish at all. I depart from my Christian brothers and sisters when it comes to unquestionable support for Israel. That's a huge push in Christian circles today, and me, I don't buy that, nor do I believe it, nor do I practice You know, you got to send money to Israel. You got to support Israel. Remember Israel, blah, blah, blah. And my policy with Israel myself that I've been convicted has been very hands off. You don't fight against Israel, but you don't blindly support them. And when you go through a survey of history, because I was actually a history major when I was in university, it seems like that a large portion of the damage in history today, if you go through and you're willing to actually look at it, unbiased, just look at it for itself and see what history says, it seems like a large portion of the damage and the wars and the atrocities that have happened throughout history has come at the hands of the Jews in some way. And I hate even saying that, because then it will come out that Joe's an anti-Semite and Joe hates the Jews and blah, blah, blah. And you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, which is why I'm saying it. But as I've studied history, it seems like whenever there's some sort of something, some sort of problem, some sort of war, some sort of whatever going on, at the helm somewhere, if not directly in the actual whatever that's happening itself, is a Jew doing something major, you know? And that shocked me, because, I mean, as we read the Bible, that's God's chosen people. But it seems like God's chosen people are doing a lot of the damage in history.
You know, I would have to echo your concerns. I don't want to appear anti-Semitic at all. That's not my goal. The goal here is to correct some distortions. And one of the distortions that you mentioned was the quote-unquote errorless nature or perception of the Jews. And here's the problem. As a Bible-believing Christian, I'm commanded to respect the fact that the Jews are God's chosen people. But the problem with Judaism today is that it is, by definition, anti-Christian. They don't accept Jesus as a Messiah. So what do you get? Well, you get what Jeremiah said, which is that Israel would become a cup of trembling. Look at how much attention is focused on the Jews as a people group and on Israel. I mean, there's no other greater powder keg in the world. And yet, these things are going on. And we as Christians have to put out the Bible and the gospel in clear terms to our Jewish brothers and sisters, because they don't know any better yet. Okay, here's the problem. I have a German background, and I suspect by your last name, so do you. Would that be correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I put it to people this way. I say, look, there is as much of a difference between being a Jew and being a Zionist as there is between being a German and a Nazi. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so how do you know who's a Jew and how do you know who's a Zionist? Well, the Bible says, by their fruit you will know them. Okay, so when people in their writings and in their actions portray a very superior attitude, portray a confidence or belief in themselves as a people group as opposed to God, that pushes people towards a Zionist mentality that identifies people in the Zionist camp. Okay, so when Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook, is interviewed, oh my goodness, about 4 or 5 years ago by now, and he's on a hot stage. And this was back in the day when all he did was wear that stupid hoodie. And he's sweating buckets on stage, okay? And he's wearing his Facebook heavy fleece jacket, and it's got to be about 90 degrees on stage, right? So the host says, "Oh, you're hot. Maybe you should take off the hoodie." And he's freaking out because he's about to come out of his element, right? So at first he goes, no, I'm not going to take off the hoodie. And then he takes off the hoodie. And in the back of the hoodie is a large patch. And that patch is extremely symbolic. It has a hexagram on it. It has 2010. It has a whole bunch of other symbology, which we're not going to get into. But the point is, analyst after analyst after analyst all conclude that Facebook played a pivotal role in the so-called Arab Spring, which started in 2010.
That is a warm hoodie.
Yeah, no, it's a thick hoodie. It's a company hoodie. We print our mission on the inside.
What? Oh my
really?
God, the inside of the hoodie, everybody. Take a moment. What is it? Making the
world more open and connected.
Oh my God, it's like a secret cult. Look at that, making the world open and connected, stream graph platform, and this weird symbol in the middle that is probably for the Illuminati. Oh, 2010.
No, it's 2010.
Okay. Oh, no.
And if you look at it, I mean, it's all blue and white, and the hexagram is actually very close to the Star of David. And this all literally, see, this is where Mark Zuckerberg tips his hand. He's not just idiot savant in charge of Facebook. That guy has a psychology minor. He knows exactly what he's doing. So when Mark Zuckerberg comes out and says, we're going to use Facebook as a substitute for Little League sports games and for the church, I mean, I get concerned. Because what you're seeing now, again, we're back to our overarching theme here. Power has shifted from monarchical authority to industrial financial authority to technological authority. Facebook is being run as a psychological operation, and it is herding people into certain camps. It is the equivalent, along with Google, it is the equivalent of digital book burning. It is the equivalent of herding people into certain groups, ready for the intellectual slaughter. So when Mark Zuckerberg says that Facebook is in some ways going to replace the church, you know what? He's right. And that is what is really, really concerning to me. So again, Eric Schmidt, Mark Zuckerberg, here we go again. You know, people of quote unquote Jewish background, and they're at the helm once again.
So, okay, so we were just talking about our theme that we had started off with, and that was authority shifting from monarchical to technological. And let's go ahead and take let's go ahead and talk a little bit here. We left off when we were talking last week. I think we only made it to question 2. Is that correct?
Yes, but I think we can summarize all the rest of your questions with one word, and that is control. That's really what it comes down to. Okay? So we live in an era that is more deceptive than ever. And I've never said this before, and I'm now going to say it. In my opinion, and I'm quoting Robert David Steele right now, ex-CIA officer. In his opinion, which is more valuable and insightful than mine, he doesn't believe that any attack within the United States, up to and including the September 11th attacks, were quote unquote as they appear to be. In his opinion, ex-CIA, all these attacks, up to and including September 11th, 2001, were perpetrated by rogue elements within government agencies.
Most terrorists are false flag terrorists or are created by our own security services. Now, I have no direct access in England, but I will tell you that here in the United States, every single terrorist incident we have had has been a false flag or has been an informant pushed on by the FBI. In fact, we now have citizens taking out restraining orders against FBI informants that are trying to incite terrorism.
So for an ex-CIA guy to come out and say that is quite remarkable. And you should have seen the hoops that he had to dance through to get statements like that approved by the CIA. Because if you're ex-CIA, you cannot write a book and say whatever you want to say. So you have to literally get it approved by the CIA. And so what I'm saying is September 11th, Sandy Hook, Charlottesville, all of these incidents are synthetic. They are managed, they are scripted, they are directed in a way that gets us to believe a prepackaged set of ideas so that we act differently, so that we act in the way that the controllers want us to act. Joseph and Gwen, what I'm talking about is the very definition of alchemy, where you take an idea and you transmute it into reality so that it affects the world. Those who control other people's thoughts are now the kings and queens of the earth.
Would you include Pearl Harbor on that list?
Yes, I would, because it is now well known that the impending Japanese attack, or the news of it, was never relayed to Washington and then back to Pearl Harbor. In other words, it was only kept locally, and it wasn't sent back to the Admiralty at Pearl Harbor. So in other words, they had no idea that they were going to be attacked. Everybody else knew, except the people who really needed to know. And that was the excuse that America needed to have to get involved in World War II, because all the polls said that Americans at the time did not want to get involved in what they viewed as a European war. And so that changed everything. And September 11th changed everything, because now, apparently, the government needs to spy on us because you just never know who could be a terrorist. Now people are justifying the being spied on. I mean, 15 years ago, even after September 11th, obviously, 1 or 2 years after, if you were to tell people, well, yeah, you're being spied on, and you know what? Any coordination that Osama bin Laden could have had would have been found out. So it's the official story about Osama bin Laden couldn't possibly be true. And you know what? This whole September 11th thing is really about spying on the American people and the rest of the world. There was a lot of resistance to that, those thoughts, 1 or 2 years after September 11th. But now people are accustomed to being spied on, and they accept it. And I find that very disturbing.
I was, it's funny. I brought up Pearl Harbor because I was talking to my brother-in-law, and he asks me when I think that the American government shifted from what it was founded on to what we know it as today. Because it's funny, I forget where in Proverbs exactly it says this. I try to read a proverb a day. Sometimes I succeed, sometimes I fail. But one of the proverbs says, because of the transgression of a land are its princes multiplied. And so you look at our government, and we went from small government, states being able to govern themselves, make their own policy, to huge government with princes everywhere being elected and staying in positions for life, determining our policy for the duration of their existence. And then, even after they're out of the spotlight and supposedly not an elected official anymore, being able to still determine policy. And that's because of the transgressions of this land. And so I was telling my brother-in-law, I was like, honestly, I would say right around World War I. And he was like, well, why do you say that? And I said, because up until World War One, really, it was the Spanish-American War. But especially during World War One, we went from isolationist policy to involving ourselves in other people's war. And then World War Two, we solidified that and became the world superpower. He was like, yeah, well, when we were talking, and I said, listen, I'm going to tell you what they said about 9/11. Pearl Harbor was an inside job. Just like they said about the Twin Towers, 9/11 was an inside job. I'm telling you, Josh, Pearl Harbor was an inside job. And he was like, you really think so? And then I kind of went over the facts that you had just said with him. And I was like, you got to understand, people need a reason to go to war. People don't just want to go to war and lose their siblings and their family and their spouses and everything else for no reason. So by nature, they're going to want to stay out of war. But if you supply them with a reason to go to war, such as Pearl Harbor and 9/11, then they're going to, not only are they going to go to war, but they're going to have a justifiable reason to go. And we've supplied them with the reason, not even knowing, and without them not even realizing that the reason that was supplied to them was a lie. And so I was telling them, so we went from being a non-interfering type of people to interfering in every stinking war under the sun within less than a century, because of the fact that we multiplied our princes through our transgression. And he was like, wow, man, I never really thought about it like that. I'm like, yeah, man, all you have to do is take a survey of history, and you'll see the change that happened right around 1900 is when it happened.
I would actually pin down a precise date when America lost its sovereignty and its character. And that precise date is December 23rd, 1913, which was the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. At that point, America lost control of its financial supply. That's when everything went downhill.
And that was at Jekyll Island?
No, that Jekyll Island was the private club in which the bankers met for a couple of years. They traveled in secret, using only first names, and they went, quote unquote, hunting there. That was the official cover. And they traveled on separate railway cars, and no servants, no anyone else, very low key in the middle of the night. And they hammered out what is a giant lie, which is known as a Federal Reserve, which isn't federal and is not a reserve. It is a private bank which creates credit out of thin air, and then it loans it to the governments of the world, especially America, at interest. Now, I was just on a podcast 2 weeks ago, and I broke down how criminal the Federal Reserve is, and Wall Street as well. And the bottom line was this. You can look this up. Approximately $39 trillion went to the Wall Street and big banks in the form of bailouts. This $700 billion figure that President Bush trotted out, that was only, you can only rack up a line of credit to the tune of $700 billion at one time. But that the flow of money through that pipe never stopped. And it's still flowing today, by the way. So you can cross-reference this. There have been academic studies as to the size of the Wall Street bailout from 2008 till today. So that's $39 trillion, plus the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve went from about 1.5 to about 4.5 trillion. That's a growth of $3 trillion of mortgage-backed securities, which no bank wanted, which is exactly why the Federal Reserve bought them up at, I guess, 0 cents on the dollar. This is kind of like I'm a bank and I've got Juan Valdez here, who's an illegal immigrant, and he's going to buy a $400,000 house with a $395,000 mortgage with no job. I mean, how's this going to work, right? but that's okay because we're going to.
Great.
Yeah, because we're going to package his mortgage, sell it to Bank B. We've contacted credit rating agencies, which in our back pocket, and we've lied all the way through our teeth about the financial viability of this mortgage, as well as 50,000 other mortgages. And while Bank B is dealing with the mess, we put out a bet called a derivative, knowing that this, say, group of $50,000 mortgages, 50,000 mortgages, is going to go belly up. So Bank B gets handed a big, steaming, maggoty pile of nothing, and we make money.
You are taking a position against the very security that you are selling, and you are not troubled.
Senator,
and you want people to trust you.
Senator, I think people.
Why would people? I won't trust you. If you came to me and wanted to sell me securities, and you didn't tell me that you have a bet against that same security,
Senator,
you don't think that affects my thinking?
And don't worry, it's backed by the Federal Reserve. I mean, that's how the mortgage-backed security system worked.